So we're going to go ahead and get started. Some of our participants are starting to roll in, but if we could advance the slides to slides, that would be great. One more. Thank you so much. So while we're all still kind of trickling in here, I just want to give us a little bit of framing and some grounding. We all understand, obviously we're all here, how pivotal housing is for our families and our communities to build healthy, fulfilling lives. Considering our collective housing futures calls on each of us to contemplate how we can each design and implement bold housing models that allow everyone the stability and ability to not only dream, but also fulfill these bold and pursue bold futures. We have the potential, especially with the recently proposed 2023 AFFH rule, to design and further access to housing futures for all. And we're so excited to have this conversation alongside all of you as we prepare to learn about and strengthen the rule, the AFFH rule, through our own comments. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to be covering a lot of ground, but we hope that you'll be able to stick around with us and learn with us. And if you have any questions at any point throughout this webinar, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to prompt our guests with your questions when the time comes. We've got some incredible speakers joining us today, including Angela Glover, founder and president here at PolicyLink, Thomas Silverstein from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, Natalie Maxwell from the National Housing Law Project, Lincoln Larmond from the Boston Tenant Coalition, Sarah Yeung from Sojourner Consulting, and then of course, Rashida Phillips and Trump Huang, my colleagues here at PolicyLink. Throughout today's webinar, we'll be providing a brief overview and the significance of AFFH, as well as some of its historical context. We will then be learning from Thomas Silverstein and Natalie Maxwell about how AFFH can impact communities and advance housing justice across the country. Then we're going to take a deeper look at the local level and understand how grassroots organizers and advocates have leveraged AFFH in their own communities. And finally, we'll be going over some of the tangible resources and avenues that you, your organization, or partnering organizations can use to engage with AFFH. Finally, we'll round out our time together with a brief Q&A. But again, please stay with us for as long as you can, but also know that we'll be sharing all of these resources, including the slides and the recording after this webinar. Next slide, please. With that, I am honored and so excited to introduce our first guest speaker, Angela Glover Blackwell. Angela is founder and resident here at PolicyLink, the organization she started in 1999 to advance racial and economic equity for all. Under Angela's leadership, PolicyLink gained national prominence in the movement to use public policy to improve access and opportunity for all low-income people and communities of color, particularly in the areas of health, housing, transportation, and infrastructure. Angela is also the host of the Radical Imagination podcast and professor of practice at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. Angela is a co-founder or co-author of Uncommon Common Ground, Race in America's Future, and she authored The Curb Cut, published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review in 2017. Angela, as a leading voice in the movement for equity in America, also serves on numerous boards. She's advised the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve as one of 15 members of its inaugural Community Advisory Council, and in 2020 was appointed by California Governor Gavin Newsom to the State Task Force on Business and Jobs Recovery. She is the 2018 recipient of the John W. Gardner Leadership Award, and in 2017, she also received the Peter E. Foss Public Service Award from the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you, Angela, so much for your time. I'd love to hand it over to you to give some insight as to how PolicyLink has worked to shape AFFH in the past and why this rule continues to be such a crucial tool for ensuring equity.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to have an opportunity to talk with all of you, and I'm so pleased to see so many who have joined to be able to get ready to make a difference in an area that is just so important for racial equity in America. Yes, it was 1999, 24 years ago, that PolicyLink was started to add its voice and its resources to the fight to create a just and fair nation. And we decided that we were going to frame our work around advancing and achieving racial equity. And to do that, we immediately declared that because of the history of racism and continuing racism in America, where you live is a proxy for opportunity. That where you live not only determines how long you live, which is so sad, but it determines how well you live while you live, your access to good schools if they're in your neighborhood, or your lack of access to them if they're not, your access to jobs, if you live in a community that has a natural job network, or your absence of access if your community does not. It determines whether or not you have access to transportation and so many things in your life. Where you live, because of racism in America, is a proxy for opportunity. And that took us right into housing. Our focus on place took us to a focus on housing. And when you think about it, particularly this month, as so many people are thinking about Black history, but I tell you, I think about it every day. But particularly as you think about the history right now, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman focused our attention on place a long, long, long time ago. They understood that getting to the place where you could thrive was so important to achieving your aspirations, to being able to access opportunity and move forward. And we also know that there are a lot of people who have been before us, whose shoulders we stand on as we try to focus on housing. Certainly we all, those of you, if you don't know, look her up. Dorothy Mae Richardson in North Pittsburgh, who actually formed and led the formation of the first resident campaign focused on better housing. And that laid the foundation for so much. This was in the early 60s, including laying the foundation for NeighborWorks. And then there's William Byron Rumford, who was the first Black legislature in California from the Bay Area, 1948. But it was 1963, among the many things he fought for, that he successfully sponsored the Rumford Fair Housing Act of 1963, the first Fair Housing Act in the country. And then there's, of course, always the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and his fight for civil rights. And he understood the fight for civil rights in its fullness, which is why among the many things that he focused on in Chicago, he helped those who were forming the open housing movement. And there's no question that that led to the National Fair Housing Act of 1968. We stand on the shoulders of giants who have been working for a long time. And we have come to understand, and it's part of how we got involved in the affirmative furthering fair housing fight, first under the Obama administration, and now continuing under the Biden administration, understanding that if you really are focusing on housing as a pathway to equity, you got to move way beyond getting rid of discrimination in housing and promoting integration. Important, but I will tell you, in the early years of PolicyLink, when we were focusing on this issue, this was not at the tip of our minds or at the tip of our tongues. We were actually looking at how you understand equity in relationship to jobs, equity in relationship to health and well-being, equity in relationship to transit, to get to health, to education and other things. And that it was important for communities to do that kind of deep dive, to look at the data, to be able to make decisions about their housing plans based on, does housing really connect to opportunity? Are we creating communities of opportunity all across the nation so that one doesn't have to move to connect to opportunity, but opportunity should be where you live. And if it is not, you should be able to move where it is. But the fight is all of that. And we're certainly bringing it into that with greater nuance now. And I am so proud of the work that you have done and that you are about to do as you lean in to actually own democracy in this country. There is no question that those who are focusing on housing are joining a long list of freedom fighters who have understood how important this is. That it is important not only for us to understand how discriminatory housing has been, how inequitable housing has been, but to know that our wisdom has to guide the reframing of this in our local communities. Community wisdom is how we get it right. That wisdom needs to be accompanied with organizing so that more people know what's going on and know what has been promised so we can hold accountable for delivering on the promise. That community wisdom, community organizing, community campaigns, community engagement, that all leads to community power. And the power to have the people who are impacted by the decision-making of government is the power and the promise of democracy. That we need to understand in this season where we're talking about democracy more than ever, that what we have to have is a thriving multiracial democracy that actually meets the glory and the promise of the diversity that is this nation. And that requires that we are engaged. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people means of us, by us, for us, and educating ourselves, understanding the data, being at the table, bringing all the resources that exist nationally to our engagement in our local communities is how we're going to make a difference. I will tell you, thinking back 24 years ago, I guess I envisioned that we would be here, but it just feels so promising. But the promise is only realized if you lean into it. Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you so much, Angela. Thank you so much for your context and the history and just the call to action, right? That we are part of a multiracial democracy. And in order to fulfill the promise of that, the AFFH rule is one tool, and it's a tool that we should own. So thank you so much for that. Before we get into the next segment of the webinar, where I'll just give us an overview of what the AFFH is, what it means, why it's important to us, I want to just launch a poll first and see how folks have engaged with the AFFH in the past. So folks can just share, it's a multiple choice poll, and it's asking, how have you engaged with it in the past? Have you submitted comments? Have you worked on fair housing issues? If you haven't quite engaged with it yet, there's an option for you there. So I'll give people a few minutes to take a minute or two to take that. Okay, we have about half of respondents have taken it. Thank you so much. Give it a couple more seconds. Okay, I will end the poll and share the results. Okay, so it looks like about 22% of people have submitted a public comment on past proposed AFFH rules. We have about half of people have worked on fair housing issues at the state, regional, or local level. That's wonderful to hear. Thank you for your work. About 16% of people have worked on fair housing issues at the federal level. And then we have about 24% of people have engaged with jurisdictions' analysis of impediments, or what was previously known as the assessment of fair housing process. And then about 36% have not had a chance to engage yet. And then we have about 8% who chose other. And if you want to share more about what that other is, please feel free to share in the chat. All right, thank you so much. Okay, so what is the AFFH? As Angela just talked about, right, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of dwellings and in other housing-related transactions on the basis of race, color, gender and sex, religion, familial status, national origin, or disability. In addition to prohibiting discrimination, the Fair Housing Act also requires HUD to administer its programs and activities in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing. This obligation also extends to HUD grantees who must go beyond refraining from housing discrimination and segregation and must take meaningful steps to affirmatively further the goals and objectives of the Fair Housing Act. So again, right, what this mandate means, right, is it's not just saying that you passively, right, enforce the Fair Housing Act, but that you have to affirmatively take steps and actions that will help to identify fair housing barriers and help to actually address those fair housing barriers. Despite this mandate, though, the term affirmatively furthering fair housing was never defined in the Fair Housing Act. And prior to 2015, and only starting in 1995, HUD implemented the AFFH mandate pretty much simply by requiring HUD's grantees to certify that they were affirmatively furthering fair housing through the analysis of impediments process to fair housing choice process. And through that process, however, AI reports were inconsistently submitted by HUD grantees, had inconsistent timelines and rules for submission, and were rarely reviewed by HUD, while HUD inconsistently enforced the rule itself. The AFFH rule was introduced in 2015 as a regulation to enforce the provisions of the Fair Housing Act and to ensure that local and state governments receiving HUD funding took meaningful steps to address patterns of housing discrimination and to promote fair housing choice. Next slide, please. So the 2015 AFFH rule required certain housing authorities, cities, counties, and states to utilize a public planning process to assess how they plan to target federal resources in a manner that meaningfully address chronic, persistent disparities in housing choice and access to opportunity. So it took that process that I just talked about, the analysis of impediments, right, and it transformed it essentially into the assessment of fair housing, although some places still did what was called an AI, and put more requirements on it, right? Specifically, it required governments to take meaningful actions to overcome those historic patterns through these planning processes, such as a community-wide assessment of fair housing, setting measurable goals, and a strategy for addressing fair housing issues and barriers, as well as regularly reporting to HUD on progress around those things. And then based on the results of the community-wide assessment, state and local governments and housing authorities were required to set measurable goals and strategies for addressing those issues. And then the 2015 rule also provided an opportunity to help change the growing trajectory of poverty and inequality, and was also intended to help HUD grantees weave together cross-sector approaches. And so involving school districts, transit agencies, housing authorities, economic development agencies, et cetera, all in order to support the transformation of areas of concentrated poverty into thriving communities, right? Understanding that housing is just one piece of it, right? It's probably the most important piece of it, but that there are other aspects to what makes a community a thriving community, and that are interconnected with the issue of whether or not you have access to affordable, safe, healthy, and fair housing. And again, it impacts whether or not you have access to quality schools, clean air, reliable transportation choices, all of those things. And so the rule really recognized that. But then what we saw happen is that in 2018, under the Trump administration, HUD suspended the 2015 AFFH rule and fair housing certification obligations for most jurisdictions. They then issued a final rule in 2020 called the Preserving Community and Housing Choice Rule, which repealed the 2015 AFFH regulations without the required notice and public comment process. And this was done despite seeing early signs of success of the inaugural cohort of communities that were required to use the assessment of fair housing process. Then in 2021, right, we saw that HUD reinstated under the Biden administration certain provisions, certifications, and definitions of the 2015 AFFH rule called the interim final rule. While the IFR did not require regular does require, and it's still in, it's still in progress right now, right? It's still in place while we wait for the new AFFH rule to go through its comment process and be finalized. While the interim final rule does require regular certification and compliance with the legal requirements of the AFFH and provides technical assistance in some forms and some support for grantees, it did not require any specific form of planning or revert back to the assessment of fair housing process that was adopted in the 2015 rule. Next slide, please. And just as Angela talked about, right, as we know, where you live unfortunately determines your access to jobs, quality education, transit, healthcare, social services, healthy food, credit, clean air, clean water, all the things, right? We need this rule, right, because the neighborhoods that we work for and live in are quite often neighborhoods whose current racial disparities can be traced back to discriminatory laws and practices of the past. And the rule is one way that we can uplift what works, right, to get at that past discrimination and those structures that continue and persist. Next slide, please. So I want to show you a very well documented example of how these things continue to harm us, how the past, how things like redlining, racially restrictive covenants, steering, blockbusting, devaluation of Black homes, how they have created disparate opportunity and perpetuated segregation that again persists today. And what you see on the screen is, on the left is a map of Philadelphia, a Philadelphia redlining map. And then on the right is a map of vacant homes in Philadelphia. So the darker purple areas have the highest numbers of vacant parcels, and previously redlined areas virtually overlap with areas of high amounts of vacant land in the city. There's a few mismatches, obviously, especially the ones near the waterfront, which are owed to a wave of investment and subsequent gentrification. But again, even though redlining is illegal, right, we still see what it leaves behind. The legacy of it is lasting. Next slide, please. Again, the map on the left is the Philadelphia redlining map, and then on the one on the right is a map showing access to grocery stores with produce across the city, demonstrating how racial disparities in healthy food access can also be traced to disparities in housing investment. Next slide, please. And then last, we have a map of Philadelphia redlining map, the Philadelphia redlining map that I showed earlier, overlaid with homicides in Philadelphia in 2019. So on this map, the darker blue areas have higher rates of unemployment. And then again, previously redlined areas overlap with most of these places. And again, hopefully through these slides, you're able to see even more clearly that relationship between fair housing, the relationship between other indicators of opportunity, and how we can use the AFFH rule as a means of knocking down some of these unequal barriers. Next slide, please. And then finally, before we go on to our next speakers, who I'm excited to bring to you, we have the new 2023 AFFH rule. And so that rule is going to build on the 2015 AFFH rule framework that I just talked about a little bit. And it changes that assessment of fair housing plan that folks had to do a few years ago under the 2015 rule into what's now called an equity plan. And those equity plans are staggered across program. They're based on size and year, and they'll be due every 5 years. And that equity plan will need to have a description of fair housing issues that are identified by the jurisdiction, a prioritization of fair housing issues, fair housing goals, and a description of community engagement activities. The new rule also provides a more comprehensive definition of what a fair housing issue is and what that means. It also keeps the community engagement requirement of the 2015 rule, where program participants must engage with the public during the development of the equity plan, from identifying fair housing issues to the establishment of fair housing goals. A few other things to note: there is some clarity on enforcement, compliance, and the complaint process. And so one of the things that HUD has added into this rule is that failure to have an accepted equity plan at the time of the consolidated planning process or the PHA plan will lead to a disapproval of a consolidated plan and will jeopardize funding under some other circumstances. There is also a complaint process that has been established where complaints can be submitted to HUD by individuals, associations, or organizations. And then there's clear links to the consolidated planning, annual action plan, and PHA plan processes. So we just put out a comment guide today. You can also, of course, go on HUD's website, and they have a bunch of materials, and many of our partners do as well. But we put out a comment guide yesterday that gives an overview of the new rule so that you can just get a quick look at all of the different elements that are in the new rule. So with that, I'll transition us to the next slide and our next speaker. So I am excited to introduce Thomas Silverstein, who is from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. Thomas Silverstein is the Associate Director of the Fair Housing and Community Development Project at the Lawyers Committee. He oversees the project's impact litigation docket using the Fair Housing Act to foster the development of inclusive communities and expand access to opportunity and fight displacement. Prior to serving as Associate Director, Thomas was counsel in the Fair Housing and Community Development Project, and he began his legal career at the Lawyers Committee 2013-2014, George and Lindsay Civil Rights Legal Fellow, after earning his JD from the University of Virginia School of Law in 2013. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Rashida. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. So I'm going to speak first a little bit about some of the successes under the 2015 rule and the assessment of fair housing process, which Rashida previewed. So at a high level, the 2015 rule resulted in a more robust fair housing planning process than most communities had seen under the analysis of impediments requirement that had been in place since 1995. It also was actually the first time that public housing authorities were really required to be at the table. There's a small nuance to that, which is that HUD never actually completed the steps necessary for public housing authorities on their own, as well as states on their own, to start doing assessments of fair housing. But because public housing authorities were going to be required to do plans, and there was an option to do a joint plan with your overlapping local government, many public housing authorities actually were joint participants with their local governments in assessments of fair housing in 2016 and 2017 during the brief window in which the 2015 rule was being implemented. And given how important many public housing programs are, including the public housing program itself, tenant-based housing choice vouchers, and project-based vouchers, actually having housing authorities playing a direct role in the process was really critical. And particularly having that role sort of transpire through collaboration with local government helped to ensure that there wasn't as much sort of siloization of conversations at the local level about fair housing planning and about housing policy in general. And I think we saw really successful collaboration between housing authorities and their local governments. For example, in New Orleans, where the City of New Orleans and the Housing Authority for the City of New Orleans worked very closely together, as well as in the City of Los Angeles and others. This is not just anecdotal or conjectural that there were these successes and that there was a more robust planning process under the assessment of fair housing. Two researchers at MIT's planning school, Justin Steele and Nick Kelly, did a really comprehensive review of the assessments of fair housing that were submitted between October of 2016 and January of 2018, when the Trump administration suspended the implementation of the rule, and also a review of how HUD reviewed those assessment of fair housing submissions. And they found that overall you had more consistent setting of stronger and more robust goals and strategies for how to actually advance fair housing in practice. So these were not just plans that included a litany of data and maps, analyzing what the current status quo is. These were plans that were actually leading towards action. That doesn't mean that they were always the strongest plans, or that they were the types of plans where all of the actions that were proposed were the kinds that organizers and advocates would push for. But it means that, at least in some instances, some of the time, you saw proposals related to, for instance, right to counsel and eviction proceedings, eviction diversion programs, changes to land use and zoning laws to make affordable housing more feasible, and better and more targeted investment in the production and preservation of hard units of affordable housing. And these were findings that really, may have been strongest in some ways in big cities that have a more progressive reputation, whether it be Los Angeles or Philadelphia or Seattle or New Orleans. Yes, those were places that were responsible for a lot of our success stories during the implementation of the 2015 rule. But there were jurisdictions, smaller jurisdictions, more rural jurisdictions, jurisdictions in more conservative parts of the country that, compared to their prior fair housing planning efforts under the 1995 analysis of impediments regime, were still showing demonstrable improvement. The city of Wilmington, North Carolina, for instance, and Horry County, South Carolina, compared to their last analyses of impediments, their assessments of fair housing represented significant steps forward. So that's a sort of snapshot, an overview of the successes of the 2015 rule. It probably is worth noting that the rationale provided by the Trump administration for suspending the 2015 rule was premised on two basic contentions. One was that too many jurisdictions, in their view, were not having their assessments of fair housing accepted by HUD. And the second was that the process was too burdensome. And with respect to the first, to this issue of too many jurisdictions, and in HUD's view, not having their assessments accepted, it's worth noting that there isn't a single jurisdiction that went through the process under the 2015 rule that ended up having its funding cut off because of the rule. And there isn't a single jurisdiction that got to the end of the road in terms of the process of submitting their assessment of fair housing, receiving technical assistance after having their assessment initially passed back by HUD, resubmission, and then possibly one more round of review and edits. There's not a single jurisdiction where HUD said, this isn't working, you're not going to get to to a point where the answer is yes. Most jurisdictions were actually accepted upon their first submission, and most jurisdictions that had to do revisions were accepted with the second submission. Very few jurisdictions went to a second round of revision and a third submission. So this really was a system that, in terms of an iterative review process, particularly for a complex new planning obligation that's being implemented for the first time, it was a system that was actually working to some extent and affording us opportunities to learn lessons from the implementation in order to iron out the kinks over time. In terms of the question of it being too burdensome, I think we're about to segue more into the contents of the proposed rule. But here, I think what we learned is that there was a lot of really useful, important, and powerful information that was put in the hands of jurisdictions to guide their fair housing planning under the 2015 rule. And sometimes you learn when you go through the process of looking at that information and answering questions according to a template that's designed to elicit responses and analysis of that information. Sometimes you learn that there is a little bit of duplication and redundancy, not a whole lot, but a little bit. And that was likely the case here. But what happened because of the Trump administration's suspension of the rule is that any opportunity to incorporate that feedback is in a feedback loop going forward and fix the process on the fly was sort of cut short. But the equity plan requirement, which we're about to discuss, really represents the beginnings of an attempt to learn those lessons and make something that's really powerful, but also efficient. Can we move to the next slide? Okay. And I believe Natalie and others will touch on some aspects of this, but I'll briefly go over a few parts of the 2023 rule. So at the highest level, the big picture takeaway here is HUD will be requiring several categories of grantees to do an equity plan on a periodic basis, typically every 5 years. And this equity plan is the sort of successor to the assessment of fair housing, which was the successor to the analysis of impediments to fair housing. It has a lot in common in terms of the questions that are included in the proposed rule itself with the assessment of fair housing, but the list of questions is not quite as comprehensive and not quite as prescriptive as that in the assessment of fair housing template from 2016 and 2017. The rule contains requirements for the contents of the plan, for how community engagement should occur, for the review process, where HUD will be deciding whether to accept or not an equity plan submission, and the timeline for implementation. The community engagement requirements are in some ways more robust than those under the 2015 rule, but also in some ways more flexible. There's a higher number of required public meetings than was the case under the 2015 rule, but there also is some allowance in the proposed rule for combining public meetings on the assessment of fair housing with public meetings on other plans, in particular other plans related to a jurisdiction's HUD grants. For instance, because these plans will typically be developed a year ahead of the consolidated plan, one might imagine a public meeting addressing both the assessment of fair housing and the annual action plan for the last year of a 5-year consolidated plan cycle. As Rashida mentioned, in general, jurisdictions that receive more money are going to have to go first. Also, as a quirk, although in general, the timing for implementation is going to depend over time on jurisdictions' consolidated plan cycles as far as local governments and states are concerned, and their 5-year fiscal year cycle or program year cycle for public housing authorities. For the very largest jurisdictions that have over $100 million in combined grant funds, they will actually be going within 2 years of the effective date of the rule, regardless of the time at which their consolidated plan program year starts. Just so you know and have a sense for your own jurisdictions, I can't sit here and say when every single one out of literally thousands of jurisdictions are going to have their first equity plan do if the contents of the proposed rule stay relatively consistent in a final rule. But actually, for a majority of local governments across the country, under the provisions of the proposed rule, the first equity plan would actually be due in 2029, which is quite some ways off. Recognizing that 2029 is not terribly soon, the proposed rule does have provisions that dictate what jurisdictions should be doing in between now and then. So if a jurisdiction has completed an analysis of impediments or assessment of fair housing within 3 years of the effective date of the rule, and here I want to be clear, we don't actually know what the effective date of the rule is because we don't have a final rule yet. But if we assume that we have a final rule, say 1 year from today, to make the math easy, for federal regulations, typically the effective date is 30 days after publication in the Federal Register. So then in that hypothetical scenario, the effective date of the rule would be March 10th, I believe, 2024. So if that's the effective date of the rule, then if a jurisdiction has done an analysis of impediments or an assessment of fair housing between March of 2021 and March of 2024, they can submit that to HUD and HUD would review it. And if it's acceptable, that would suffice for their fair housing planning in the meanwhile, and help make sure that their certification to HUD that they're affirmatively furthering fair housing is valid. If a jurisdiction does not have an analysis of impediments or an assessment of fair housing that they've completed in that 3-year window, for instance, if they did their last AI in 2019, they would have to do a new assessment of fair housing or analysis of impediments. I would argue in my own comments, perhaps, that doing an equity plan consistent with the new rule should also be an option, because I don't think that's necessarily going to be more burdensome for jurisdictions than doing an AI or an assessment of fair housing. And I do think there's a logic to aligning how the sort of interim planning activities look with the planning activities that are being required going forward. But they would have to do a fair housing plan of some sort, whether an AI or an assessment of fair housing, or hopefully an equity plan, within 1 year of the effective date of the rule. So that would start the clock ticking for a lot of jurisdictions across the country, that they have to do some kind of fair housing plan between, say, for example, March of 2024 and March of 2025. The last thing I'll mention before handing it over to Natalie is that the proposed rule would include a complaint process, as Rashida mentioned. From the standpoint of the civil rights and fair housing community, I think this is extremely important. It's important not just because, I think we all have the experience of recognizing that HUD is not going to identify every instance of severe non-compliance on its own without things being brought to the department's attention. It's also important because HUD's staffing, frankly, to review all of the equity plans that it receives, particularly in the busiest years like 2029, is limited. HUD just simply doesn't have as much staff as we would like the department to have. So to have the ability of community groups and stakeholders to bring to the attention of HUD really deficient equity plans, I think is very important. And this is not a complaint process also that should be thought of solely in relation to inadequate equity plans. This is also a complaint process that can be used to challenge the underlying affirmatively furthering fair housing certifications of jurisdictions. So if there's a jurisdiction that is taking actions that are inconsistent with the substantive duty to affirmatively further fair housing, engaged in policies and practices that perpetuate segregation or that results in mass displacement of communities of color, those are the types of activities that also could be challenged through a complaint process, even if a jurisdiction's planning process on paper seems superficially fine. And with that, I'll hand it over.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And just to point out your attention, a question came in through the chat if you want to take it on while Natalie's going, but someone asked, does this mean jurisdictions can interpret the law however loosely they choose to? So with that, I would like to introduce Natalie and Maxwell, who is the managing attorney at the National Housing Law Project. Natalie's work at NHLP focuses on protecting the fair housing rights of low-income tenants and communities, preserving rural housing, and preserving housing for low-income tenants impacted by disasters. She began her legal career as a 2005 Equal Justice Works Fellow, and she is a graduate of the University of Florida and earned her law degree from the American University Washington College of Law. Thank you so much for joining us, Natalie.
Thanks for having me. So just to explain a little bit about NHLP and the work that we have historically done. For folks who don't know, the National Housing Law Project is a legal advocacy center, and we focus on advancing housing justice for poor people and communities. And so we do a lot of work around the federally assisted housing programs administered by HUD and USDA. And so in terms of our prior advocacy for around the AFFH rule, we've really focused our advocacy around the obligations of public housing agencies and increasing the role of impacted communities in the fair housing planning process. So we have done that in part by commenting on prior versions of the rule. And in a little bit, I will get into kind of why that piece is important. And I mean, you've kind of heard teasers from Rashida and Thomas about the impact that advocates have had on the AFFH obligation over time. So in addition to working and commenting on the rule, we also host a network of over 1,600 housing advocates and resident leaders. And so working with that network to also provide comments on the rule, as well as analyzing and providing comments on drafts of fair housing documents, be that the prior analysis of impediments or assessment of fair housing that have been drafted by local jurisdictions. We also provide training and technical assistance for advocates on using the AFFF obligation as an advocacy tool with PHAs and local jurisdictions. And in California, following, as Rashida mentioned, the 2015 AFFH rule being rescinded, the state of California actually adopted the 2015 AFFH rule obligations into state law, so that there would be a lasting impact of that work and a concerted effort by jurisdictions across the state to affirmatively further fair housing, regardless of what happened with the federal law. So if we can go to the next slide. So really the point here is that for us, the AFFH is an important tool in advancing housing justice. And part of that is because, as you've heard, the proposed rule creates a structured fair housing planning process that requires federally funded community and development and housing recipients to really assess the fair housing issues in their jurisdictions and to set measurable goals to overcome those barriers to fair housing choice and opportunity. And this planning process really presents a key opportunity to empower communities to call attention to the fair housing issues that they see, such as segregation, and other disproportionate housing needs that are not currently being addressed. So we think it's critically important that both local jurisdictions and PHAs take into account community input with regard to identifying what local fair housing issues are, as well as creating solutions to those fair housing problems. The other important part about the proposed rule is the accountability measures. And so by having a rule that actually requires PHAs and jurisdictions to identify the goals, it allows community members to actually monitor to what extent the jurisdictions are actually making any sort of progress on those goals. In addition, the proposed rule provides minimum requirements for community engagement, as Thomas mentioned. And this is critically important for impacted communities who have a unique perspective on how local policies are impacting their housing opportunities. So one way that where we have seen this play out is around prior to the 2015 AFFH rule, that it was not uncommon for PHAs to not really engage with their local housing participants about issues of fair housing and challenges that people were having. For example, housing choice voucher holders were having and accessing housing in their communities. And so organizations that are led by directly impacted people, as well as organizations that serve those communities, really have a better sense of what's going on, and are also better able to reach out and survey folks to get a clear idea about the fair housing issues in the community. And as we have seen, public housing residents and Section 8 voucher holders know better than anyone else how those programs truly operate on the ground and on a day-to-day basis. And as far as the complaint process, this is important because prior to the current proposed rule, there was no complaint process. And what HUD is saying is they are clarifying that yes, individuals and communities community members can file complaints against PHAs or jurisdictions that fail to meet their AFFH obligations, and really flags those issues in a way that, as Thomas mentioned, HUD does not have the staff to identify. It also demonstrates a commitment to monitoring jurisdictions and bringing them as well as PHAs into compliance. And so this is also an important part of the proposed rule. So next slide, please. Part of why it's important to strengthen the proposed rule and why it's important to comment on the proposed rule is, as you've heard from Rashida and Thomas, we've done this before, and as a result of the efforts of individuals, communities, community organizations, and national organizations, the rule is improved in some ways over the prior fair housing processes. So as far as the equity plan, one thing that we're seeing is the proposed rule contemplates a more transparent process and requires that the equity plans be posted on HUD's website, as well as annual updates to those equity plans. And this is a direct result of prior AFFH advocacy. The other thing is that this is a proposed rule, and so it is open to public comments, and it's not the final version of the rule. And so we want to make sure that the key features that we've talked about here make it into the final rule so that advocates can use it in their ongoing advocacy with the PHAs and local jurisdictions. Another reason that commenting on the proposed rule is important is because it can be used to address problematic practices and policies. So I've included here a reference to a guide that NHLP co-authored with Poverty and Race Research Action Council about working with PHAs to adopt policies that affirmatively further fair housing. And this really came out of the work that we have been doing on the 2015 rule and ensuring that advocates are not waiting for the final adoption of the rule or final adoption of equity plans to really start engaging with PHAs, because this is a process. So, for example, you know, one problematic area that we've been working on is the challenging the use of crime-free housing policies and nuisance ordinances. You know, there's been a proliferation of these policies throughout jurisdictions across the country. Oftentimes, they're a result of perceived changes in the racial or ethnic demographics of a community. And so that's the type of program that, while it's might be passed by a jurisdiction, clearly impacts the ability of folks who are participating in PHA programs to access that housing, whether that's the public housing or housing choice voucher holders themselves, or family members who are essentially being excluded from living together. And then some ways that we have seen that those policies even further used to target PHA programs is targeting the assisted housing inventory for enforcement of these ordinances. You know, another way that the public commenting process can be used to strengthen the rule in terms of providing specific examples and thinking through, and advocates thinking through what else we need in the rule to better support local advocacy. So another example from the subsidized housing context is the Section 8 program, which is a voluntary program. So obviously there's not an explicit federal fair housing protection for source of income, but we've seen many states and local jurisdictions have adopted these laws as a way to protect housing choice voucher participants and ensure that they are able to find, to open up housing opportunities so that folks are not being segregated to certain areas of the community. You know, we also have seen where PHAs have adopted policies within their own housing choice voucher programs that actually contribute to segregation, such as PHAs that are located in majority white or low poverty communities, instituting residency preferences so that they are essentially excluding people of color from their housing choice voucher program. So this is, you know, the point here is that the PHA policies, you know, can work with or against the policies of jurisdictions with regard to fair housing opportunities. So the last point that I'll make about the importance of the commenting process is around building community power and increasing community engagement. So the proposed rule includes a community engagement piece, but it's important to note that whatever is in the proposed rule really is going to be the floor. And so based on people's experiences in their communities, if there are specific actions that would help increase that floor, those are the types of things that it would be helpful for people to comment on. If there are issues in terms of community engagement, and language access is a common one where we see where advertising for opportunities to input are only being provided in English when there are communities that are limited English proficient that are within that PHA service area or jurisdiction. And finally, I'll just say that the other piece around the community engagement, as I mentioned, is that this is a process. And so using the commenting period as an entry point to identify other advocates that you can work with long-term, once that rule is finalized, to actually implement the AFFH obligations within your community is super helpful. So with that, I will stop talking and pass it back to Rashida.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Appreciate your presentation and your charge as well, that this is an important process for us to comment on. I am now going to pass it to my colleague Trom, who's going to introduce our next speakers.
Thank you so much. All right, before I introduce our next speakers, we're going to do another quick poll to get a sense of the room. I'm going to open this up. We'd like to know what fair housing issues your community is facing. So please take 30 seconds to, once I open this poll. Oh, perfect. All right. So please choose all that apply. What are some dominant fair housing issues that you are facing in your community, ones that you're working on? Pick all that apply. And if there are any really big ones that fit in the other category that you'd like to share, please feel free to put that in the chat. Give it another 10 seconds or so. Yeah, seeing some source of income discrimination in the chat. Want to point to a recent victory, the state of Illinois, for folks who are working on that issue. And let's close the poll and get a sense of where people are. All right, so if you all can see, some of the biggest issues are access to affordable housing, displacement, gentrification, segregation, healthy housing, and accessible housing. But of course, all these issues are important and are going to be addressed in everyone's public comment. All right, thanks so much for participating in that. Okay, now I am super excited to transition us into our next set of speakers who are going to speak to the work that grassroots organizations have been doing using the AFFH rule, and more specifically, how they've leveraged the assessment of fair housing process to advance housing justice in their communities. We're very lucky to be joined today by speakers from Boston and Philadelphia, and I'm going to start by introducing Lincoln Larmond. So Lincoln is an activist and the chair of the CAC, or the Community Advisory Committee for Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. It's a mouthful, that worked in partnership with the city of Boston to complete the city's assessment of fair housing. Lincoln is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps who has spent many years in leadership positions, leading teams primarily in human services and other nonprofits. He currently serves on the board of Action for Boston Community Development, Boston Medical Center, Boston University Institutional Review Board, and he's also the president of Action for Equity, the leading grassroots equity organization in Boston focused on racial equity in jobs, housing, and transit. And last but not least, he is also a board member and consultant for the Boston Tenant Coalition, a leading grassroots affordable housing coalition and the anchor organization that is leading the CAC, which he'll speak about. He's committed to equity and justice and strives to influence and generate change through advocacy for intentional and responsive public policy. Welcome, Lincoln, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the introduction, Tram. And I'm happy to be here. And so I'm going to start by saying, so the city of Boston AFFH was adopted by executive order signed by Mayor Michelle Wu in January of 2022. And what I'm going to do, I have a number of slides, and I was thinking about the presentation today, and my thought is I'm going to do things a little differently than I intended, because I think there's some really important lessons that were learned because this signing of the executive order adopting the AFFH was a culmination of 6 years. And there's some important lessons that were learned that I think could inform others who may be thinking about their own AFFH, or maybe even looking ahead towards the Biden equity plan. So in 2016, City of Boston was required to submit the AFFH. It gathered together this group of fair housing and other advocates who were primarily individuals who were part of the 2010 analysis of impediments that was done in Boston. So that group reconvened in the city of Boston with the task of really helping the city around submitting an AFFH report and also engaging the community. Next slide, please. So the Obama 2015 AFFH rule was really a guiding principle for us in terms of the goals of the AFFH. And it really set in our mind a clear view of the fact that it wasn't sufficient for cities to identify discrimination as a talking point. That they had also to identify disparities in housing, access to opportunities, and so on and so forth. But it really was about taking meaningful action to create change. And a large focus for the CAC as we interacted with the city of Boston was really making that a centerpiece of what we did. And in doing so, we decided fairly early that it was critically important that the AFFH be informed by people who were most impacted by it. Next slide, please. So it is really important to talk about how we got here. So as I said before, the AFFH is adopted. Right now we're in phase two. The phase two really is about implementation. The city has a plan for, in fact, doing that. But how we got to that place is, number one, is a co-partnership with the city of Boston. And I say that because, you know, there were multiple iterations of the AFFH, as you can imagine, over the six-year period. And there were different iterations of the AFFH, precisely because, you know, the CAC kind of pushed back and certain interpretation of what the AFFH should look like or what it should represent. And a lot of that was constituted around the fact that, and this will come up later on, we focused a lot and the community's voices. For example, we had 14 community meetings, over 500 resident attendance. We also had surveys. The Boston Housing Authority sent out 2,000 surveys to some clients who responded to the survey. The participants who engaged in the community meetings responded to the surveys, and the survey was based on one that was used in New Orleans for Hurricane Katrina. We adopted it to really speak to what the questions we're trying to ask and feedback we're trying to get for the residents of Boston. And part of this interaction with the city is as community would share their lived experiences, and how do you transition from those to have that then reflected in an AFFH that really inform policies and goals? And some of the initial challenges we had was some of the limitations that the city actually faced on itself. And one of the big limitations was that you know, we had the city team kind of working on and submitting the AFFH, but it was, say, 4 city departments that was part of the process. And we believe part of the reason why there was some struggles in terms of having a more comprehensive AFFH was the fact that the city staff didn't believe that they could write goals that and dictate other city departments for them to execute. And having said that, I'm going to jump to slide 5, CSE goals, please. Yeah. So it's one of the interesting things for the CAC that, and for others who were contemplating doing this, is that you have to really clear what your goals are. And for us, it was clear that we wanted an AFFH that was comprehensive in the sense that in terms of the scope. And for us, it wasn't that the city of Boston didn't want comprehensive change or wasn't committed to the AFFH. It did and was, but we had a different interpretation of what that meant in terms of the role of government and what government was capable of doing. And that was, as I said earlier, manifested itself around how broadly the the stories that we're hearing from the community, from the residents, should be reflected in the goals. And I think the important thing as the relationship evolved over time is that we got to a place where the final AFFH happened in February of 2022. And as I mentioned before, there were multiple iterations of the AFFH. And the fact that we got to a place where we were all in agreement 100% and fully owned that AFFH was in fact a testament to the partnership. And I think it's critically important that, as you know, if a community or groups are doing an AFFH on their own, or if you do with a partner like the city, it's really, really important that both parties are really clear in what the scope of that is, because if they aren't, then these challenges will in fact manifest, which will kind of delay some of the work that you do. And one of the big things for us that we eventually got to a place where we all pretty much agreed on what the scope of the process was, but that took some time, it took some effort. But I think the final AFFH is one that we can all be proud of in terms of how comprehensive it is. If you could go back to slide 3, please. Which is, yeah, how we got it, yes. So another important factor because of what we got here was certainly Mayor Michelle Wu signed the executive order adopting the AFFH. And you know, when candidate Wu was running for mayor, the CAC sent out questionnaires to all the candidates around fair housing and asking if they're willing to commit to adopting this document. Candidate Wu committed to do it while she was running in primary to adopting the AFFH by executive orders, and we're happy that within her first 90 days of in her administration, she did in fact do so. One of the also critical factors in terms of how we got here was the membership of the CAC. It goes without saying, and it cannot be overstated, the importance of the CAC to the AFFH. It's a testament to each member, the strength, commitment, knowledge, and perseverance of the CAC, who valued our roles as the community's representatives and took that extremely seriously. We were blessed to have members who are subject matter experts, and this was really critical in terms of helping us not only in our interaction with the city, but to really push on advocacy in terms of how comprehensive the AFFH should be, and what really constituted real and meaningful a fair housing change. The other critically important testament in terms of how we got here was our community partners. We, and in particular, Boston Tenant Coalition, did a fantastic job outreaching to our community partners, 35 community grassroots organizations, in terms of mobilizing their constituents to show up to those community meetings and sharing their stories and participate in those meetings, actually leading those meetings and recording their stories, so that they in fact could be then reflected in the AFFH document. We also had community partners. We also had a lot of national conversation with people in California and other parts of the country who were conducting their own AFFH. And we learned a lot of best practices in terms of what was happening there, what worked, what didn't work, and so on and so forth, that we could bring back to the process that we were doing. We found it extremely helpful. One of the things that we learned was that a lot of these groups had consultants who were helping them to develop their AFFH, and the city of Boston did not. And we really pushed the city of Boston to have an independent outside consultant to help shape the AFFH, which the city eventually did do. And the AFFH process for us really changed drastically overnight with that hiring of the consultant, Dr. James Tenant, does a lot of work in Boston around equity and such. This is a huge change and a huge improvement of the process. But one of the most critical important thing, as I mentioned before, and a testament to how we got here and the efficacy of the work, was really the community who shared their stories in ways that I think captured some of the key inequities and barriers that impacted fair housing, but really then spoke to what the need was for certain policies to mitigate them. And finally, one of the critical things that really helped us get to where we are, where we did in terms of signing up the AFFH, was having a lead or an anchor organization that really led the process, which was Boston Tenant Coalition, the organization that I'm part of. So now I'm gonna switch to slide 5, the CAC goal. So for people who are considering their own AFFH, I mentioned the scope of the document and how important that is. But this, for us, it was really critically important that the AFFH address historic inequities. And it was also critically important that the policies reflected the lived experience of residents, which I already talked about. But another critically important piece of that was that the goals were responsive to the community feedback. Like, we didn't want the community to share all these really deeply moving stories in terms of what was impacting their lives, and it kind of sat there on a document, but there being no response relative to goals and solutions to mitigate them. So it's critical that went hand in hand. The other piece that was important for us was that the goals were prescriptive as opposed to being aspirational. The 2010 analysis of impediments process resulted in a fantastic document. It was very aspirational, sat there on the desk and did nothing, but it didn't really talk about meaningful action relative to how you're going to implement these goals. And we wanted to make sure that AFFH was prescriptive in terms of, each goal in AFFH has a key to the department was responsible for it, what the goal entails, and what success looks like. One of the other key critical important things we wanted that was part of our thinking process was that we didn't believe an AFFH, if we completed it, it went to the city, it would be executed with the kind of robustness and commitment if it was just a document that didn't have the buy-in from the mayor. So from the beginning, we wanted to make sure that the AFFH was adopted by the mayor and signed by executive order directing all city departments to implement the goals. That was one of our key goals, and the executive order was in fact committed to just that. And the last piece is that we wanted to make sure going forward that there was a commitment to honoring these goals long-term over time, regardless of what administration was in place. So we wanted it to be created a monitoring committee who would monitor continuously over time and had the support and the buy-in of the administration and I guess the authority to effectively monitor and evaluate and measure the city's ability and progress towards executing those goals. Those are part of the executive order that the city did in fact honor. Next slide, please. Next one.
Link, we actually have to move on to our next speaker, unfortunately, because we're about to close out in a few minutes. But these slides will definitely be available in full, and hopefully, Lincoln, we can continue the conversation in some way, because this is really interesting and I think helpful to a lot of people who are doing this in their community. So I'm going to pass it back to Tram, and we'll hear from our last speaker, Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to pop 2 things in the chat so that people can read more about the huge successes of the CAC related to the zoning amendment that was passed, and that really concretely solidifies AFFH in the Boston planning process. And so want to uplift that, and please check out those 2 resources and the slides later to read more. So next, I have the pleasure of introducing Sarah Yeung, who is based in Philadelphia. Sarah has over 13 years of experience working in and partnering with community-based organizations, and her work is informed by her experience as a community developer, her relationship with the cultural community of Philadelphia Chinatown, and her work as a policy advocate and researcher, both locally and across the country. She is the founder and principal of Sojourner Consulting, a consultancy which provides support for efforts to create new paradigms in supporting community change and revitalization. And with that, I will pass it over to Sarah. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tram, and thanks to PolicyLink for hosting this really important discussion. Listening to all of the different speakers and to Lincoln speak just now about the impacts of AFFH in Boston, I'm reminded of how contextual these processes all are and how we define success in different ways in each of our cities. So I'm going to use more of a storytelling framework for my part, since I'm, finishing out an hour and a half webinar, and also because I think we usually use more of a policy framework when we talk about AFFH. But stories are how we make sense of the world, and at its core, AFFH is an opportunity to reframe the stories that we tell about where people live and how we make decisions around that. So I'm here because Philadelphia was one of the first jurisdictions to go through the process in 2017. And at the time, I was working for a CDC in Philadelphia, Chinatown, which was a hub of services for the Chinese-speaking community across the city. So I'm a consultant now, but at the time I was a community developer. And at that CDC, we really followed the lead of other advocacy groups that were larger, citywide, and focused on housing issues. And my job was really focused on particular affordable housing projects and to manage neighborhood responses to planning and zoning efforts. So I understood the need and the context, but my particular role and the role of my organization was focused on particular projects and on very local community-based matters. Next slide, please. So at the time, the city had more of a historically Black population. And in recent years, the Latino and Asian communities were growing rapidly. And these communities had more significant proportions of individuals who did not speak English well, or LEP folks, limited English proficient. A lot of neighborhoods in Philly at the time were also gentrifying and experiencing displacement of low-income residents and residents of color. Housing costs were rising quickly all across the city, and placing those pressures really on low-income renters were the most vulnerable populations. Philadelphia has the unfortunate moniker of being the poorest big city in the country. So on the nonprofit side of that, there's a very strong and active network here around nonprofits and housing advocates. However, the housing resources here have historically favored homeowners and low and moderate residents rather than the most vulnerable populations of low-income renters. Another context I'll provide is that Philadelphia also relies on a highly decentralized delivery structure. So they focus on contracting with community-based nonprofits to provide housing services and to increase access to vulnerable communities. So there were nonprofits that served LEPs and low-income renters, but they generally weren't part of these contracting systems, and they generally weren't very active in the city's housing policy processes. So at this point, 2017, it was a totally new process. Certain people in certain places like PolicyLink were very excited about it. Almost nobody in Philadelphia was aware of it. I only learned about it because a national group called me up, a national group that supports Asian and Pacific Islander communities. They said, oh, Philly's going to be in the first cohort, and it's an opportunity for your organization to advocate because they're actually required to do engagement for underrepresented populations like LEPs. But that was really it. No one from the city reached out to me and said, well, you should pay attention to this. This is going to really affect you guys. And it wasn't until after the city finished its engagement process and they put out their first draft plan that there was more meaningful advocacy activity. And when I printed out the draft plan, what really caught my eye was the data that showed where city resources were, and especially the racial breakouts for each participant. It went so granular as to list out all of the different Section 8 projects, where they were located across the city, the breakout of racial participation for each project. And so it really gave you a comprehensive view of housing resources across the city and who was receiving them and where they were located. And for myself, as an advocate for the Asian community and the Chinatown community, it was really the first time that I saw Asians being included in measurements generally. Historically, you see, Blacks and Latinos and Hispanics being more regularly included in these data plans. And so the assessment, showing the Asian population and even in areas where they couldn't provide a really great measurement of their participation, just having that column present really was shocking, and just confirmed our sense at the time of the underrepresentation, and at points the lack of representation of Asians in housing resources. So, that kind of provided a light bulb moment for myself at the position that I was in at the time. And I kind of reached out and did some cold calling because nobody else was advocating around this issue, to find other people who were interested in it. And so if you could go to the next slide. And so there were 5 of us that kind of stumbled on each other. There was a Latino advocacy organization. There were 3 other legal aid organizations, including Community Legal Services, where Rashida Phillips worked, as well as Public Interest Law Center and Regional Housing Legal Services, who I see is on this call as well. Later on in the second round, we would be joined by ACANA, which is a community-based organization that serves African and Caribbean refugees and immigrants. But this group of advocates, worked together briefly to coordinate our testimonies and to really knock on the city's door and hold them accountable to a more robust engagement process. That was really our focus at the time. And the city and housing authority were both fairly responsive. I think that their attention was really focused on this process because it was new, and because it was a new framework of coordination for the 2 agencies as well. Next slide, please. There were, for the lack of resources that we had, and sort of the brevity of our participation, there were significant gains for all of the advocates. For example, CLS really used the process to call attention to the eviction crisis, and eventually, they generated support for their work on the eviction prevention project, and eventually they secured a right to counsel pilot, and they successfully worked with city council members to pass measures and funding to support those programs. SEBA, the Latino advocacy group, used those conversations as well to work out support for new affordable housing developments for Latino CDCs, and also to continue advocacy for language access in the city. On PCDC side, where I worked, the CDC didn't have the resources to continue the advocacy, but they were able to successfully secure city contracts to provide delivery of housing services. And that meant, at the city level, for the first time, the city was delivering housing services in the Chinese language in meaningful numbers. I also say that there was attention from advocates and institutions across the board. There were studies done on access to housing services broken out by racial and ethnic groups, and a couple of news articles that just outlined the conversations that we were having with the city. So, looking back, I think we successfully harnessed the conditions that we had at the time to achieve gains. We took advantage of the fact that it was a new process, and we took advantage of the timing, where we had these populations that were growing, and it was kind of hard to ignore that they were underrepresented. Also, it was a point in time when conditions for low-income renters were becoming really hard to ignore. I'm sure if we had more resources, we could have achieved more. But those who were able to follow up after the process, I think they were also able to pull those levers and kind of achieve long-term gains. At the time, I'll also say that I focused more on those immediate policy and funding gains, but I think looking back, there was also a shift in how leaders in the city saw their work on housing issues. I was on a panel with the director of communications of that office later, and he said that they were surprised at how people expressed a desire to see opportunities located throughout the city, not only in those areas where low-income people of color lived. And I think that the public sector is not often surprised. They usually take a triage approach, and they have limited resources, so they think that those resources should be applied to places where it's most needed. And there's a lot of sense to that. But I think they found that, poor people don't want to think of their lives as fixed in place. They want to be able to imagine their future selves as having options. And also, when people are locked out of areas where there are opportunities, they're still dependent on those resources. So they have relationships with a number of different places, not only where they live. So, I think overall it was a moment in time where the city and the housing authority had the chance to kind of snap out of a day-to-day perspective, and as a result, able to better hear some different stories about what communities want. Next slide, please. So in 2022, Philly went through this process for the second time, this time under completely different conditions. For one, it wasn't really required. They were required to certify, but had all but told the city that the report wouldn't be placed under much scrutiny. The city also had much less capacity to carry out the process. They did still hire a third party to write the report and to carry out engagement, which signaled to us that they still wanted to demonstrate commitment to the process. They also, improved their data engagement processes, and I think they learned their lesson from the last process and had a much more targeted engagement process, which, kudos to the advocates on that side. This time around, PolicyLink was also able to offer some external resources through a small grant to provide technical assistance and organize participation. So I provided that TA to a couple of community-based organizations that focus on LEP communities. And so we had PCDC, which serves the Chinatown community, SEBA, which serves a number of Latino communities, and we also brought on ACANA, which serves African and Caribbean immigrants and refugees. So the binding thread between us really became our focus on LEPs and language access. This time around, given the local conditions, we knew that the overarching goal would be more to hold a place for AFFH rather than to achieve significant policy wins. We wanted to keep the focus on the potential of AFFH and to increase awareness around language access. And so I was tasked to work with each group to outreach to their networks and to outreach to community members and turn out comments. And this was really the first time we tried to message AFFH locally versus work within our small advocacy coalition. So it's very experimental, and we learned a lot about how to get buy-in. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm talking really quickly because I know we're running out of time. So takeaways. I think that most people today have talked about it as a policy framework, and you do need to understand the rule itself to know where the levers are to frame that strategy. But for folks on the ground, what I think they're really focused on is the new coalitions and relationships that you need to build in order to take advantage of that framework. So AFFH creates a space, but you still need a lot of resources to fill that space up because people haven't filled that space up before. They haven't even realized that space is there. So it's about organizing, it's about getting buy-in, relationship management, and also messaging. And you're building capacity for people that don't have it. And ultimately, you're building a different relationship between communities and the government. I think one takeaway that has endured is those collaborations that were set up in 2017. And in different ways and across different places, we've now seated people that understand the broader potential of fair housing and how it can be used as an equity framework. Rashida's not at CLS anymore, I'm not at PCDC anymore, but we're working in different places to bring this all together and to thread this conversation through from 5 years ago to where we are today in a different policy context. And we're also bringing it outside of AFFH, and especially for language access, bringing that conversation into other rooms as well. I think that initial process is really important because you really need to have a focused delivery of comments and of awareness, and so you have to have a burst of resources around that effort. But I think also investing in contextual local messaging is a missing piece that I've seen, because in Philadelphia in 2022, AFFH still remained the most important and the most misunderstood housing policy process in the city. At the grass tops level, there's a lot of talk about compliance and enforcement, I think because there's a lot of lawyers involved. But the grassroots groups are not going to find that a conversation where they feel a place, where they feel compelled to participate. And the implications of the rule can also be framed as largely long-term, which makes it a hard sell. Also, I think when local governments hear the word compliance, they tend to think, what's the least I have to do to satisfy this requirement? Because they have limited resources and they're also risk adverse. So I think the parallel conversation is, compliance and enforcement, yes, but also it is how do you connect with groups that you have never connected with? And how do you manage that process so that you can have a productive conversation and an informative conversation? And ultimately, like I was saying, it's about creating a different relationship with those communities and with government. So defining that success in a more long-term way. I think I'm at the end. So I want to end this story to say that AFFH did that for me. It was the first time I personally saw policy used to reach my community and to bring them into the system where they were previously invisible or underrepresented. So for me, I went into policy advocacy full time after this process took place. And the way that I work with communities is to help to bring this framework to that level as well, so that they can be brought into the system, brought into the conversation, and brought into the light. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for sharing that story and sharing both Lincoln and Sarah for sharing how impactful this process is on our communities, but that there's more work to be done, and just also the opportunities that it can bring about. So thank you so much for everyone who has rocked with us this long and this far. We are almost at the end. I want to launch one more poll before we close out. I'm going to transition us to Trom and Jasmine, who will just talk about some other upcoming things that we have. Also want to thank all of the speakers again, Thomas Silverstein, Natalie Maxwell, Angela Glover Blackwell, Sarah Yeung, Lincoln Larmond. Thank you so much for your time. And then also my colleagues, Trom and Jasmine, as well as my colleague, Jen Pinto, who's been behind the scenes, moving the slides and helping us out. So thank you all. And thank for everyone in the audience who has attended. So I'm going to launch this last poll. And then we'll talk about some upcoming resources. And again, all of this stuff will be available on our site soon. But I want to ask people, are you planning to comment on the proposed AFFH rule? So it will be published. We're hearing in the Federal Register tomorrow. And so it will be 60 days from tomorrow. If I'm doing my math right, around April 10th will be when the public comment period closes. So we want to know, will you be commenting on the rule? So of the folks left, so far, about half of you will be commenting. About 4% said no. We have another 40% who aren't sure yet. And then folks who are, they may not comment on the federal rule, but they will engage in the process when it comes to their town, city, or jurisdiction. All right, I'm going to end that poll and I'm going to transition over to Jasmine, who will take us home. Jasmine and Trom.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rashida. And thank you everyone for your participation today, especially our speakers. I think one of my colleagues is going to drop our latest resource in the chat, but we are so excited to provide a comment guide to you all. Our hope is that should you or your organization be interested in engaging with the public comment process, no matter your background, you will be able to pick this guide up and use this resource to draft a strong, robust comment. This guide provides some background information on key introductory topics that will give anyone a thorough background on AFFH and the federal rulemaking process, and detailed steps to submitting a powerful comment to the new AFFH rule. One special aspect of the tool that I'd love to touch on are the various considerations that we've provided for assessing the equity impacts of HUD's new rule and how you can evaluate equity in your own comment. Next slide, please. Some of the topics that are covered in this equity assessment include the historical and systemic framing of equity, the prioritization of equity, the inclusion of reparative equity, equity in data, enforcement and accountability. So all in all, this equity assessment provides pointed questions that you can use to inspire your drafting and your writing to uplift equity as a North Star for the newly proposed AFFH rule. So, but let's say that your work in your organization or your passions are not directly involved in fair housing, but you know that the overlap is there. Trom, could you tell us a little bit more about the ways that the AFFH toolkit can inspire cross-sector engagement in the AFFH rule?
Yes, I would be happy to. Thank you. So we do have a section that's very specific to cross-sector engagement, and it makes very clear connections between housing and different issue areas so that you can not only include cross-issue talking points in your own comment, but also encourage your cross-sector partners to submit a comment. So specifically, we call on our partners in sectors like education, transportation, environmental justice, climate equity, workforce development, community safety, and public health to submit their own public comment. So if you if you were looking through the guide, and I hope that you all look into it in more detail following this webinar, you'll see that in addition to making connections between housing and various housing issue areas, the section also provides examples of things that you can include in cross-sector comments to help build the case for a stronger AFFH rule. So I'll go into one example, or actually I'll go into two examples. So for example, if we look at education, there are many ways education and housing interact, such as housing allocation decisions impacting population shifts and school funding, or housing instability leading to chronic absenteeism. So an example of what an education advocate can include in their comment is a demand for the rule to address the fair housing implications of eviction and displacement on protected class communities, especially as we acknowledge the devastating impacts that a lack of adequate tenant protections has on student success. And then one last example I'll mention, public health. So if you are a public health advocate, a strong comment can include demands for the equity plan to look beyond the prevalence of disease when creating strategies to develop healthy communities, but consider equally important factors that shape health, such as safe environmental conditions, access to high quality and affordable healthcare, grocery stores, access to parks and green spaces, and pairing local planning processes like the equity plan with community health needs assessments and community health improvement plans. So that's one way to suggest the alignment of strategies from at the federal and local level. So those are just a few of the highlights. Don't have time to cover them all, but I hope you all read it and share with partners. And I'll end with inviting you all to another webinar. We're going to be hosting a comment party. It will be as fun as it sounds. So we're going to have a comment party taking place on February 28th. So that'll be a few weeks into the comment period. We'll have plenty of time before April 10th to submit your comment, but we're going to be hosting a party where we'll walk through the rule in more detail and spend some time putting together comments, helping you craft your specific comment, helping you bring in some cross-sector talking points, helping you make the case for why we need the AFFH rule to be stronger. So the link to the comment guides in the chat, the link to the comment party registration is in there. We hope that you register and also invite your cross-sector partners to join. And I look forward to seeing you so that we can all have a big impact on strengthening the AFFH rule so that moving forward, more local communities can see the victories and successes on the ground, just like we have heard Sarah and Lincoln tell us stories of. So thanks again for joining us, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you on February 28th.
Thanks, everyone.